The U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, leading to Japan's surrender and ushering in the nuclear age. I sit down with Peter Kuznick, professor of history and the director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. I met Peter Kuznick at our studios in Washington, D.C. Peter, I'm delighted to have you here. We're going to do a deep dive, but I wanted to kind of start on a personal level. I can remember years ago, my mother and I had an argument about nuclear weapons and Truman's legacy. And my perspective, of course, was, this horrible what happened. But hers was like, you have no idea what it was like to live during that period of time. She said, we just wanted that war over. It ended the war. It was a good thing. And I want to get your thoughts on just kind of that argument and its placement in time.
Yeah, I've been involved in that argument for many, many years now. And it's very frustrating that Americans don't learn real history. At the time, first Truman's comment was that this was revenge for Pearl Harbor. That wasn't going to fly. So then he started to argue that the bombs were necessary. The only way the U.S. could avoid an invasion of Japan was to use the atomic bombs. The only other alternative was for the U.S. to invade, and the Japanese were fanatics. They'd fight to the death, and we'd lose. He said Marshall told them, and he writes this in his memoirs, that the U.S. would lose 500,000 boys in the invasion. So therefore, the bombs are not only necessary, they're moral. They save lives. They not only saved American lives, but then they later say they saved so many Japanese lives and Chinese lives by ending the war. But that's a total lie. But it's at the heart of this idea of American goodness and the American empire and American exceptionalism. The reality is very, very different, but the Americans don't learn this so much later.
Peter Kuznick has written several books, including Beyond the Laboratory, Rethinking the Atom Bombings, Nuclear Power in Hiroshima, and co-edited Rethinking Cold War Culture. Let's talk about the global balance of power. How did this shape that, the dropping of the bomb?
It was crucial in establishing American hegemony. The United States had a monopoly on atomic bombs till August of 1949, when the Soviets tested their atomic bomb. But to that point, we had a monopoly, and we're still going to have monopoly over delivery systems for more years after that. So the Soviets are going to try to catch up very quickly, because the United States tests its hydrogen bomb in 1952, and the Soviets test a prototype hydrogen bomb 8 months later. So it was 4 years before they caught up on the atomic bomb, but much more quickly before they caught up on a hydrogen bomb. We later discovered that wasn't a real hydrogen bomb, but it was close enough for anybody's purpose.
I know that in some respects, a lot of Chinese probably welcomed the end of this war because of the suffering. And I think there's even been some discussion that, this perception that the Japanese were victims because of what happened in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but in many cases they were the victimizer. And it just these perceptions. Give me your sense of how other countries viewed this.
You're right that not only the Chinese, but other Asians who were victimized by the Japanese welcomed the atomic bombs, partly because they believed that the bombs ended the war. The reality, as Oliver Stone and I have been arguing for years and shown and proven, is that the atomic bombs did not end the war. And not only did the atomic bombs not end the war, the Americans knew there were 2 other ways to end the war without use of the atomic bomb. One was change the surrender terms. The U.S. was demanding unconditional surrender, which meant to the Japanese the execution of the emperor as a war criminal. They weren't going to tolerate that. To them, the emperor was a deity. MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command issued a background report in the summer of 1945 and said, execution of the emperor to them would be like the crucifixion of Christ to us. All would fight to die like ants. Almost all of Truman's advisors, military and civilian, urged him to change the surrender terms to tell the Japanese they could keep the emperor. And Truman refused to do so. The only one who really pushed him on that was Jimmy Burns, And Burns said, you'll be politically crucified if you let them keep the emperor.
Why do you think he made the decision?
Why did we use the bomb? It's a sad story, but we were sending a message to the Soviets that if they interfered with U.S. plans in Europe or the Pacific, they were going to get this and worse, much, much worse. And that is exactly how the Soviet leaders interpreted the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So in early June and July, former Japanese Prime Minister Hirota went to the Soviet ambassador in Tokyo, Malik, and effectively asked them to help get better surrender terms. So Malik writes back to the Kremlin saying the Japanese are desperate to surrender. So the Soviets knew better than anybody that the bombs weren't necessary, and they tried to figure out why they were used. And the only conclusion they could come up with this was a warning to them of what would happen if they interfere with U.S. plans.